Let's explain a complex state law with a simple man. A man named Fred. Wave at the people, Fred. Fred owns a house in Colorado. Let's say it's worth $400,000. Tough to find, I know. Fred also owns his own business. And let's say for the sake of argument, Fred's shop is worth $400,000 too. Convenient, I know. Property taxes aren't assessed on the full value of your home, but on an assessment rate set by the state. Fred's home property taxes are assessed at 7.15% of the value of his home. Fred's business property tax is assessed at 29% of the value of his shop. That 29% business assessment rate is frozen by a piece of the Colorado Constitution called the Gallagher Amendment. The Gallagher Amendment, passed by the voters in 1982, requires that 55% of property taxes collected in Colorado have to come from commercial property owners, businesses in other words. The rest, 45%, comes from residential property owners. At the time, the constitutional amendment locked that tax assessment rate for commercial property at 29%, can't go lower or higher, and it set the adjustable residential rate at 21%. But a lot has changed since 1982. Colorado's grown significantly and the value of homes has skyrocketed. As those values go up and tax revenue increases, the tax rate for residential property has had to decrease to keep meeting that ratio.
At a statewide level, we have to apply this blanket policy, and it just doesn't work well for different parts of the state, especially rural and suburban areas that depend on these property taxes to help fund those important services.
The argument made by the bipartisan group of lawmakers who sent this repeal of Gallagher to the November ballot is that ratio requirement, 55-45, has led to lower tax rates for homes, which continue to increase in value. They argue schools, county governments, fire departments, and other special districts are losing out on money because non-residential property isn't increasing as much in value.
If Gallagher is not repealed, if we don't vote yes on Amendment B, we're looking at 10 to 15% cuts for those fire districts, for the hospital districts. EMTs rely on property tax.
Their proposal is to eliminate the ratio requirement. If you vote yes and agree, your residential property tax rate will freeze where it is and won't drop below 6% like it's expected to next year in order to maintain that 55-45 split. The bipartisan opponents consider that a tax hike.
That difference in the assessment will raise the amount that homeowners will pay if this passes. They'll pay that additional $203.7 million that they otherwise would not pay.
They argue there are better ways to get more money to schools and special districts, and that trying to squeeze more out of homeowners in the middle of a pandemic would be wrong.
The average hardworking homeowner that is already struggling in many cases to pay their mortgage, this could put people out of their homes.
So I know that was a lot to take in. Consider this as well. Property taxes, they help fund schools. And when the property taxes aren't enough to do that, the state has to come in and backfill. So proponents of Amendment B say you got to remember we're in the middle of a pandemic and the state's going to be a little hard up for cash with COVID and all. The opponents argue that the whole tax system could use an overhaul first before you go ahead and repeal what they call the lone tax break out there for residential property taxes. Kim, a lot for voters to think about as they get their ballots in the next few weeks here.
You did a good job. If for those of us that have lived here for a long time, we can't explain Gallagher. So in a short amount of time, Steve, a lot to sort out.
I know a lot of people hear it and they probably think it's that guy that smashes watermelons with a sledgehammer. It is not. It's a very complex tax law. Dennis Gallagher was a state lawman at the time, hence why it's called the Gallagher Amendment.
Okay, we'll be reading more. Thank you.
from small towns across Colorado.
Breckenridge,
Placerville, Woodland Park, Callahan,
Canyon City,
Wiley, Delta, Fruita,
Windsor, Springfield,
Rye,
Trinidad,
La Junta,
Silverton,
Walsenburg,
Monte Vista, Vail.
To earn degrees that matter. Visit adams.edu to learn why so many kids growing up in small towns prefer a small liberal arts university in Alamosa. Adams State University. Feels like home.
At Adams State University, we ask one thing of our students: be the best you. No matter who you are, you'll find a home at Adams State, where your success as a student doesn't happen by accident, and your educational journey isn't bound by classroom walls. We call it the Adams Experience.
At Adams State, be the best you.
Be the best you.
Be the best you.
Be the best you.
Be the best you. Be the best you.
Be you.
At Adams State, be the best you.
Seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. We're live.
Good evening. I'm Dr. Cheryl Lovell, President of Adams State University. On behalf of our entire campus, I would like to welcome you to our beautiful Richardson Hall Auditorium. This building is the first to be constructed on our campus, and as we're about to celebrate Adams 100, the kickoff celebration of our 100th anniversary as an institution, which will begin February 2021, we are honored to hold this debate in such a historic place. The Adams State University community, like all Coloradans across the southern part of Colorado, are anxiously anticipating the 2020 general elections this November. In our efforts to help the region to get to know the candidates running for state offices, Adams State is proud to bring this type of high-quality programming live from Richardson Hall. As a state, we are stronger when we all participate in the electoral process. And as the leading rural serving university in Colorado, we believe it's our duty, it's our obligation to help present the issues and bring candidates together to discuss them. It is our commitment to continue to be a strong advocate for rural Colorado and for our very own San Luis Valley. The debates this evening represent our renewed efforts to facilitate and convene important dialogue around issues critical to the electorate of Colorado House District 62 and Colorado Senate District 35. Our first debate features the candidates for Colorado House District 62, Republican Logan Taggart and Democrat Donald Valdez, the incumbent seeking re-election. Then at 6:30, Our second debate will feature Colorado Senate District 35 candidates, Carlos Lopez, Democrat, and Cleve Simpson, Republican. This state Senate seat is open following the term limit of current state Senator Larry Crowder. Again, welcome, and we thank you for joining us. Now to our moderator this evening, moderator of our debates, Denver 9 News political reporter, Marshall Zellinger.
Thank you, President. And because we are maintaining social distancing and proper protocols, I'll remove my mask now. After watching last night's presidential debate, I thought we could have a sequel here to, I'm just kidding. I just want to introduce where we have on stage here, closest to me, Representative Donald Valdez, who for the remainder of this debate I will be demoting from Representative to Mr. Valdez. Farthest from me, his Republican challenger, Logan Taggart. The very sophisticated coin flip method is what we use to determine who would go first in opening statements. So we begin 1 minute with Mr. Valdez.
Thank you, Marshall. Good evening. It's great to be here at my alma mater, Adams State University, where I began my story as a student. I'm Donald Valdez, a fifth-generation native of the San Luis Valley, running for re-election for Colorado House Representative District 62, which includes Alamosa, Conejos, Costilla, Rio Grande, Saguache, Mineral, Huerfano, and Pueblo. What Colorado needs in these uncertain times is continued steady guidance and experience with values rooted in rural Colorado. I'm here to give a voice to all that understand the unique differences of living in rural America, living close to the land and celebrating our rugged individualism. Together, we will keep our focus on the future, our children, and funding for K-12, as well as higher education institutions. We must make sure their physical safety needs in conjunction with mental and social emotional health are being prioritized and met. Now is the time to listen to and support our educators. We must bolster our trade schools and community colleges and understand they provide students with unique opportunities. We must reassure our college and universities and students that their educational experience will remain safe and reliable, whether in person or online. And that's why I'm running for re-election for Colorado State House Representative District 62. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Valdez. Now the 75-second opening by Mr. Taggart.
Thank you, and thank you to Adams State for hosting this. Thank you to the voters who are listening in. My name is Logan Taggart, and I'm running for House District 62. I'm running to make sure that our schools are the best they can be for our communities, that we can attract the best teachers. I'm concerned about the direction that our state is heading, and I'm running to make sure that our constitutional rights are not further eroded. I'm running to make sure that our votes are not thrown away to states like Florida, New York, and California. I will oppose national popular vote. I'm running to make sure that our communities are economically stable. I'm running to make sure that water is a viable and strong resource in our district, and this has earned me the support of Senator Larry Crowder and retired General Harold Reed. I have experience. I'm a former Levita Town Board member, mayoral candidate, and vice president to the Chamber of Commerce. I'm a sixth-generation Coloradoan running to represent a larger constituency in southern Colorado. I'm an independent leader going to Denver to restore balance. I'm dedicated to serving not only Republicans, but Democrats, unaffiliated voters, and all those who live in this district. I'm Logan Taggart, running for House District 62, and I'm asking for your vote. Thank you.
The candidates know we have 60 seconds to answer the questions, and they're being kept on time. Off camera here, there are some cue cards that show 30 seconds and out of time. I'll do my best to make sure that I don't necessarily interrupt when you're out of time. If you're wrapping up a thought, I'll let you wrap up. If you start to go into the Iliad, we'll prevent that from happening. Mr. Taggart, you're going to have the first question. It's COVID-specific related, as much of the questions might hit on that theme. But because of COVID and decisions by the Democratic majority, the legislature didn't meet for the maximum 120 days this past session. Do you believe the legislature has done its part during the COVID-19 pandemic, and what would you have done differently as a single voice in the legislature?
Sure, thank you for that question. One of the issues that happened during the COVID pandemic was that our legislature gave up a lot of their powers to our governor, who through executive order became the sole decider for what was best in Colorado, instead of letting local communities who have the best say in what happens to them. It's not a one-size-fits-all sort of situation. So if I had been in office, making sure that we'd had the opportunity to meet, through other means, making sure that we can pass legislation ourselves and making sure that we're not just giving our power and voice back to the governorship.
Mr. Valdez, as part of the Democratic majority, that they have the power, you have the power, and decided to get work done in less than the maximum allowed amount of time. Was that appropriate, and what was perhaps left out?
Well, with so many unknowns and with the pandemic, we recessed to adapt to the pandemic. And we went back to the Capitol to make sure that we could still pass the state budgets, pass the school finance. But with that, I will be here with you, shoulder to face whatever challenges come our way. We will plan, we will pivot with contingencies to meet the needs of our institutions, small businesses, communities, and most importantly, our families. So with that, we must all come together during this pandemic and help each and every one out.
I've lost track, and I'm going to follow up here with another 60-second question to Mr. Valdez. I've lost track of how many executive orders we're at now with Governor Polis. I did a story a couple weeks ago, it was 170 or so. What is one executive order from the governor that you thought went too far?
Well, Marshall, one of the executive orders was to close all businesses. In my aspect, everyone is important, and we need to keep our small businesses open. We need to continue economic development, but going too far, closing our small businesses was huge. A lot of the family businesses, whether it be downtown, right here in Alamosa, were shut down, where you see a lot of the larger scale corporate businesses still open. So with that, I would continue to see how we can continue operating our small businesses.
So you would not have gone to the overall, everybody in the state followed by the same rules, executive order of the stay at home?
Yes.
Mr. Taggart,
yes.
What is one executive order that you agree with the governor on?
Sure. I can't think of one. To be honest, I think executive orders, as previously stated, are not in the purview of what the governor should be doing. I think it takes away from the government that we have set up, that takes away from the voices of our legislators who really represent our more local communities, our local districts. Obviously, we have regulations that our governor is trying to make sure people follow, but blanket executive orders that everyone has to follow, they go too far, and they don't correlate from one major city to our more rural communities here in southern Colorado.
A quick follow-up here. Does that include the executive orders for states of emergency because of drought, wildfire?
Well, those can be passed while going to the legislature. I mean, there's no reason that we have to always be using that power for things that, if there's time that we can go through the proper channels. I mean, obviously there's going to be some emergency situations. Wildfires might be one of that. COVID-19 was not that case.
Mr. Taggart, I'll begin with higher education with you on this question. And as I said, COVID-19 is going to play a theme throughout a lot of the questions asked tonight. And due to the COVID pandemic, higher education by the state legislature was cut $493 million. That's 58%. However, in one-time federal CARES Act funding, the governor replenished the majority of that. I think it was $450 million, not quite the full amount that was cut by the state legislature. What happens next budget cycle in a place like Adams State here without those one-time funds, the way we are expecting the revenue from the state to look next year?
Sure. It's going to be tough. I mean, I think a lot of educational institutions are going to have to make some cutbacks. There's going to have to be some sacrifice. I think we were blessed to be able to get some additional funding this year. Hopefully we can see enrollment numbers up at a level next year that will help counteract some of the lost revenue that we've seen, and that these institutions can still be able to provide quality education to our communities, because they do serve an essential role.
What would you cut ahead of higher education if you had to make cuts?
What would I cut?
Or is higher education at the top of the list?
Well, higher education probably is not on the top of the list. That's something I think that whoever is serving on the Budget and Finance Committee is going to have to look at, someone who's in the legislature who can have the numbers in front of them. Not being purview to exactly what our state budget is spent on, it's hard to say what exactly needs to be cut. But education is not going to be on the top of my list.
Sneak preview, there are going to be more themes about priorities throughout this debate. Mr. Valdez, what happens to Richardson Hall? Are we filling this hall next year? What happens to Adams State if we're looking at the same financial scenario next year?
Well, Marshall, cuts are hard, and it's not easy. Yes, I'd like to fill all our institutions and increase enrollment, but we need to find sustainability and a balance, whether it's higher education or K-12, healthcare. All throughout the state budget, we need to find a balance. And it wasn't easy this year. We had to cut more than $3 billion in our state budget. And looking at it, I'm very thankful we got some CARES Act of $450 million for higher ed. It helps, but it's one time. What are we going to do next year? We still got to find and fix the formula for higher ed.
Do you ask voters, residents for more money, or what do you cut?
We can put it to the voters, but also we need to balance the state budget on all aspects. Education is number one priority. I don't want to cut education no matter what. We need education now more than ever. Students have been without education since early March. They came back in August to schools, and still there's some kids who are trying to find online connectivity through internet.
Mr. Taggart, education cuts are often done with equality in mind, meaning a percentage, what a percentage to CU Boulder is the same kind of percentage to a school like Adams State. Sounds fair, right? What's not fair about that?
Well, what's not fair is that the funding formula doesn't give the same opportunities. So say a certain amount of dollars at that school, because they have more resources, might go further. Adams State might have to build more of their resources. Money might not go as far. So, it's not really fair to just say, well, it's done on a percentage basis. It really needs to be done more on a needs basis and looking at the community and how much that, they're able to offer to that local school.
So how do you address the discrepancy of a rural or a smaller area school getting impacted worse, albeit equally, than someone like CSU?
Sure. Well, that's something that's going to have to come from the legislature. They're going to have to look at the way that they have the funding formula set up. It's going to be their responsibility to bring these schools together to see what needs to be done to change that funding formula so that it is more equitable across the different learning institutions.
I'm going to stay with you just for this quick follow-up. You're running to be part of that legislature, so
yes.
If you're in that seat, which you want to be, your idea is?
To meet with the various institutions, to bring them together. I mean, you have to have collaboration between these schools. You have to have collaboration between the Colorado Board of Education and the legislature, and those sitting on the committee of Education, Rural Affairs come together and be able to decide, what makes the most sense.
Let me congratulate both of you for staying not only on time, but under time. This is amazing for any debate I've been a part of. Mr. Valdez, I know you've been a part of many joint budget committee meetings, attending, seeing the decisions that are being made. I asked the same question that I asked Mr. Taggart. It sounds equitable the way cuts are looked at across the board, that 10% to one school is going to be 10% to another school. Is that fair? If not, what's not fair about that?
Well, Marshall, sitting on the JBC, listening on some of the hearings, cuts are hard. To Adams State University or to Fort Lewis or Western State, we need a funding formula for all these institutions, because in rural Colorado, especially right here in the San Luis Valley, it's a unique university to the San Luis Valley. Adams State is a Hispanic serving institute. We need to make sure that we're funding these institutions now more than ever. Why? Because it's critical. There was a time when I didn't want to go to college. I just wanted to stay home and farm with my father. And if it wasn't for my mother saying, "Hey, you know what? I think you should go to school, get a degree," and I really appreciate my parents, my mother and my father, for egging me on to go to Adams State. Coming here, it opened my eyes. Not only networking, but also learning about different aspects in the world, and most importantly, business.
We're going to Benjamin Button and go backwards now to K through 12 education. Schools in rural Colorado face challenges that the Front Range schools probably don't, from recruiting teachers and retaining teachers, offering good salaries, handling the budgets of a smaller school district. Based on my knowledge of how the school district budgets work, whatever the county property taxes can't cover, the state backfills. So what can a state lawmaker do? This question goes to Mr. Valdez first. What can a state lawmaker do to get more money specifically for rural schools?
Well, Marshall, currently on the ballot is Proposition EE. A yes vote on Proposition EE increases taxes on cigarettes and other tobacco products and creates a new tax on nicotine products, including vaping products. A new tax revenue will help education, will help with health care, and put towards preschool initiatives. Taber's is a huge aspect right now that we need to look at and bring back to the voters. I believe that we can repeal Tabor and make it so that we're funding not only K through 12 and preschool, but also higher education and infrastructure for the state of Colorado.
You bring up Proposition EE, and if it were to pass, there's nothing that prevents a future legislature from changing how that money actually gets spent. So this is a dual question in follow. Why should someone vote for EE and trust that the money will actually go towards schools?
Marshall, we need to make sure that this funding goes towards, not only is it's set aside for education, housing, tobacco prevention, healthcare, and preschool. So out of those percentages for those sectors, yes, we need to make sure that higher percentages does go to education, and I will make sure that it does. As long as I'm in office, I will make sure that it goes to education and to the sectors that it's accounted for on the ballot.
Mr. Taggart, let's start with Proposition EE, and then we'll get back. Your thoughts on, can we trust the state legislature, if that were to pass, to have the money go to where it's, as of today, says it will go?
Sure. And this reminds me of going back a few years when marijuana was on the ballot. And the promise there was that this is going to fund our schools, not to the full extent that we were promised. Some of that money's been taken to other projects the legislature sees necessary. So I don't think we can trust EE to really benefit our schools. Another issue with Proposition EE is it's a regressive tax. It's a tax on those who can least afford it. It's going to mean less money out of their pockets that could have gone to food, gas, things that they need. There's no evidence that a higher tax on tobacco products decreases the amount of smoking, especially in teenagers. The extra 30 cents, $1, whatever, is not going to make the difference between their choice to use nicotine products or not.
I know it's a little bit more than just 30 cents on this proposal, that it goes up drastically. When it comes to rural school districts K through 12, how does the state legislature filter more money, if needed, to rural school districts, not necessarily proportionally, than what we see in the Front Range?
Sure. Well, one of the things that schools have the ability to do because of Tabor is to be able to go to the taxpayer, ask for additional funds for that school. So getting rid of, and I'm sure we'll talk about the Gallagher Act, Proposition B coming up, that's not going to increase funding to our schools. And so what can school districts do? We can do things to help save money. We can do energy audits, fixed cost audits. We can look at alternative sources of education, being able to have full school choice voucher systems so that parents can decide what's really going to be the best education for their student.
Do you support mill levy overrides, detabering of a local area?
Well, I mean, if the voters pass it, yes. I think we need to, first off, always respect what the voters do. If it's a ballot measure and it passes, then that's the choice of that area and that community.
Mr. Valdez, do you know anyone who's been left behind with remote learning because of technology issues?
I don't know anyone personally, but I know that there's probably individuals out there who are missing out, whether it's school nutritional food, learning online, not having that connectivity of broadband throughout rural Colorado. It's essential that we connect rural Colorado to the Front Range, now more than ever, because education is key. Giving that student, 1 to 1,000 more ways to learn, absolutely. I would like for all our kids to go back to school, but I understand during this pandemic, we want to make sure they're safe and healthy in all aspects. So with that, we need to continue, we're looking at connectivity with broadband and making sure that not only broadband, but also our cell network services is available.
What's the state's responsibility for that versus the school district to handle it?
In my opinion, it's both. Not just the school districts, it's the states also. And the state, we need to make sure that their funding trickles down from the federal level to the state, and then we need to allocate it to the local governments too.
Mr. Taggart, this question is only for you, because it's based on last night's presidential debate, so I need to ask a Republican this question.
Okay.
President Trump is the de facto head of the Republican Party.
Yes.
And when he was asked during last night's debate if he would denounce white supremacy, and specifically the Proud Boys, his response was, stand back and stand by. Is that the position of the Republican Party you associate with?
I think our president could have been clearer in that statement. The Republican Party is absolutely against any form of racial injustice, any form of violence, especially in regards to race. That's not who we are as Republicans. We're for individual freedoms, individual rights, being able to live the best kind of life that we can for our individual selves and for our families. And racism just has no part in that party platform. So I believe he should have been a little clearer in that statement.
That seems to be a parallel response to, well, I guess maybe I ask, what would be more clear?
Standing up and saying, I absolutely disavow any white supremacy group, anyone who advocates for racial injustice, and that would be a lot clearer, and that's my position here tonight.
Now we go to some lighter, quicker yes and no questions.
Okay.
Yes and no usually involves just one word. We can get into some of the commentary after we get through the yes-no part. I'm going to preface this for those of you watching that may not be clear on what is a very lengthy Colorado ballot of 11 statewide issues. Your blue book is 100 and some, it's long. Proposition 113 is the National Popular Vote Compact, which would give the states 9 electoral college votes to the presidential candidate who gets the most votes nationwide. It won't take effect this year, and it doesn't take effect until enough states agree to the compact. Yes or no? I think we've already heard from Mr. Taggart, but I'll start with you. Yes or no, Proposition 113?
No.
Mr. Valdez? Yes or no?
Yes.
Another yes or no. Do you support Amendment B? And again, this is just yes or no. We'll get into the context later. Amendment B is the repeal of the Gallagher Amendment, which impacts the assessment rates that determine your property tax. Mr. Valdez?
Yes.
Mr. Taggart?
No.
We'll come back to that. Do you support Proposition 118? That establishes the paid family and medical leave insurance program that would provide 12 weeks of paid time off for family and medical reasons through a payroll tax paid half by employees and half by employers. Mr. Taggart?
No.
Mr. Valdez?
Yes.
And yes or no, Proposition 116, reducing the state income tax from 4.63% to 4.55%, perhaps one of the most clear things to vote on. That's about as much context as we need. Mr. Valdez?
No.
Yes.
Mr. Taggart? It's amazing that we have the back and forth. Let's talk briefly now about Amendment B, the repeal of the Gallagher Amendment. Let's start with Mr. Valdez. This is, we could spend the rest of this debate and I could try to explain the Gallagher Amendment and how it impacts other parts of the state. I don't have the knowledge base at the moment or the time, and I don't expect either of you to be able to summarize this in 60 seconds, but I challenge you anyways. Why should a voter say yes to something that is very hard to grasp in the first place?
Well, Marshall, and you're right, the Gallagher is very complicated, but repealing it it's currently on the ballot, and we need compromise. We need to come together to find a solution and an answer. Right now, our districts are hurting, whether it be our fire districts, or rural firefighter districts, our libraries, our local governments. We need to fund these entities to make sure that we can continue to keep them sustainable in the future.
Mr. Taggart?
Sure. So the Gallagher Act protects your property taxes from being raised over a certain percentage. Decreasing the Gallagher Act, or sorry, getting rid of it, voting yes on Amendment B, basically takes away that protection that you have, that your property taxes aren't going to be raised to a certain level. This keeps Colorado attractive to people wanting to move here, people starting out wanting to buy a home. They're able to get more home because of the decrease that they have to pay on their property taxes. And proponents of the bill claim that it won't raise your taxes, simply amend them. Well, if it's not going to raise them, why do we have to amend them? It's certainly not going to lower your taxes. So the bill is not honest in its wording, and it's not something that we should vote on.
I'm going to move on to a topic that I got a crash course in the last week, which I need to know more about from the two of you, water, especially the Rio Grande Basin and the sustainability of the environment in the San Luis Valley. It seems to me that one of the most high-profile changes to Colorado's water future, it wasn't really about water, but it was about sports gambling. So if you ask anybody perhaps in the Front Range, what do you know about Colorado water, they may say, hey, that's where the money from when I gamble on the Broncos goes to, at least the Colorado water plan. I should never ask a naive question, but Mr. Taggart, what does, let's just start with the sports gaming first. What does any of that money mean for the San Luis Valley?
That means that we're going to be able to use some of that money to fund various water projects, infrastructure. This is particularly important not in necessarily just the Rio Grande, but the rest of our district, the Arkansas Valley, where water storage is a major issue over there. So whether you're for gaming or not, it's good to see some of that money being used to something that is so vital and so important, which is Colorado's resource, and it's an essential part of this valley.
I've seen the Colorado Water Plan, which might be longer than the Blue Book. Okay. I know it's much longer than the Blue Book. Mr. Valdez, how much of sports gaming, how much should the San Luis Valley rely on that to solve any of the area's water issues?
Well, Marshall, I would take all 10 million for the San Luis or the Rio Grande watershed, but we need to spread it out throughout the state. As Colorado is a headwater state for many other states, we need to make sure that water is essential and water is number one on our list. Putting funding towards education, conservation projects, not only in the Rio Grande River, but throughout the state. Here in the Rio Grande, we're needed of funding now more than ever. We need fire mitigation. We need plans put in place along the Rio Grande River. There's 7 counties, and Rio Grande starts up in Hinsdale County and flows all the way through into the New Mexico border. Now is more than ever, we need to put forth some of those fundings to work and put a plan and an action plan to That's why that book is so thick, Marshall.
You mentioned it needs to be dispersed throughout the state, at least with the sports gaming money. Let's forget just that money. If the drought continues, snowpack levels don't get to where we need them to be, what do you do as a representative to fairly handle all of the state's needs, knowing you represent the 8 counties of southern Colorado?
We need to make sure that House District 62 gets its portion of the funding aspect. Yes, we've been in a drought, but we need to climb back out of it. Snowpack is a huge aspect we need to look at, but looking at continuing conservation practices on the land, our soils, how important are they? They're most important to our plants, to our water. Knowing the amount of water that goes into each and every particle of our soil is imperative now more than ever. We need to put plans putting more acreage aside so that we can utilize water where it's needed with valuable soils. Putting more cover crops in our soils. And when I say cover crops, more diversity, so that we use less water in our crops now more than ever. Yes, we have a large potato, alfalfa, small grains, but looking at other ways and other crops to maintain our water levels here in the San Luis Valley.
Mr. Taggart, how would you make sure that the area of southern Colorado gets what it needs while competing with the Front Range?
It is a tough question because water is a finite resource in this area. One of the ways that local governments can help maintain or control the water and the water projects happening in their counties is through the 1041 powers that are given to local governments. Basically allows them to slow up or excel different projects that are happening, especially in regards to water. And it is going to be tough because we have to meet our obligations downstream for our interstate compact. We've got to make sure that's viable for our agriculture users who rely on it for their livelihood, and those who need it for its municipal purpose as well. And so it's going to be tough. What we need is a representative who understands the importance of it, who's going to go there and make sure that our water is staying in this county.
I'm going to stay with you for this next question about the Renewable Water Resources Project, spearheaded by former Republican Governor Bill Owens, seeking to export 22,000 acre-feet of water from the San Luis Valley to Colorado's Front Range. First, do you agree with the Front Range Republicans on this?
Well, it's not just the Republicans, but no, I absolutely do not agree with this. And let me say to all the voters who are watching this event this evening, I will never support, I will never vote on anything that could lead to the exportation of water out of the San Luis Valley. Our communities rely on it too much for the livelihood, for our ability to grow crops. It's what helps us thrive and succeed. It's what helps Denver be able to eat. So it's a bad bill, or a bad effort to try and pull water out of this valley. So I do not support it.
Mr. Valdez, you sponsored a bill last year that I feel addressed this topic. It never made it out of the first committee, though. Is that evidence that you've done all you can as a single lawmaker from southern Colorado, and it's really up to the metro area majority to decide?
Well, Marshall, no. I will continue advocating for our water here in the Rio Grande watershed and for southern Colorado. Going back to what you mentioned earlier, the Republican, did you say that as the Republican Water Resources that's trying to take water out of the San Luis Valley? Because we need to make sure that our water stays here in the San Luis Valley. It's essential not only for our farmers, our ranchers, our community, but it's our livelihood. Water is our livelihood in each one of our communities, and we need to make sure that it stays here, not only today, but for the next generations to come.
In relation to the bill, that, and if I'm off base, that I feel like it touched on this, but it went to a committee and it never made it past the first step. So what as a single legislator can you do to fulfill that promise?
Well, Marshall, I'll continue to bring people to the table and see how we can move forward a policy that that keeps our water in the San Luis Valley. Going back to that bill, I think there was some individuals that we need to continue making that compromise of the bill and make sure how do we make that now more than ever, and even on the Front Range. I need to get more votes in the Front Range now more than ever to make sure that our water is vital.
We're going to wrap up this topic with one last question to Mr. Taggart. What's wrong, for people watching, what's wrong with the idea of providing perhaps more money than you would get for that resource? What's wrong with the idea of, I'm going to pay you more for that resource than you're actually going to use it for? Here, take the money.
Sure. Well, the problem is that as we get rid of our water in this valley, what other resources do we have that make us important? What else helps us be able to attract the attention of Denver? Pretty soon, if we lose our agricultural community, we lose the communities here that rely on it so much. Southern Colorado is already struggling enough. We don't need to lose one of our main industries in this valley. So of course people have their right to do it, but hopefully we can work with other groups, the Rio Grande Water Conservancy District, to find alternatives so that people don't need to sell out their resource, get rid of their water, and ultimately hurt our communities.
Mr. Valdez, I'm going to shift to a topic you were a part of at the legislature. When the legislature reconvened, it passed a law enforcement accountability bill that was quickly signed into law. The law exempts state troopers and correctional officers from personal liability if they do something illegal while on the job. So why should state employees be exempt, but local jurisdictions be held to both the standard and the cost that's required to fulfill the requirements of the law?
Marshall, and when that bill came forward, it put a burden on our local sheriffs and local police, our local sheriffs and city police on it. We need education in all aspects, but as citizens, we need to have accountability too. Law enforcement needs accountability, but the citizens need to citizens need to make sure that they're accountable for their actions too, though.
I noticed in Greenwood Village when the city council wanted to protect its police force by saying you're not going to be held to this personal liability part of the law, there was a protest against them, multiple protests. I didn't see any protests against state lawmakers for allowing the state employees to basically do the same thing, the state troopers and correctional officers. Did you know that was part of the bill when it passed, that they were exempt?
Yes, we did make sure that Colorado State Patrol and Department of Corrections was exempt out of that. We also made sure that in our local counties that there wasn't more hardships. But right now, what I see is we're losing a lot of local law enforcement. We need to recruit and retain, but the hard part is right now just recruiting individuals in our local areas.
Mr. Taggart, pro law enforcement?
Very much so.
So I ask, why should certain law enforcement be exempt while others are held to the standard?
They should not. Our standards should apply to everyone as far as how we want our police officers to behave and act. But the problem with this bill is that it set regulations on different protocols that police have, the liability that they have. That's one, not fair to the law officers who have to go out and actually do the job. In the community I live in, we have 2 marshals, and one of them just quit this last week over this exact bill because it goes too far. It doesn't allow local cities, municipalities, local counties to be able to come up with what they think is the safest way to keep their police protecting its citizenry and protecting the police officers as well.
Let's explore this for a minute. I've heard the same thing of other metro area law enforcement that have quit, and some had said specifically because of this legislation. It's kind of twofold. What I'm going to ask you is, one is, this provision about the liability basically says, if you do something illegal while at work, you may personally have to pay out of your pocket for some of that. So, what's wrong with that? And why do you want that law enforcement officer who's willing to quit over that? Why would you want that person as law enforcement to begin with?
Sure. Well, the issue is you're not going to attract new people to this profession if they know that it comes with such a high liability risk, if they know that, you know, what could be something that is simply a mistake, that they're going to end up being ruined for the rest of their lives. Who's going to want to be a law officer? So it's not helping us be able to get better law enforcement. It's just hurting those who want to go into the profession. Why do I want this individual? Well, you have to know him personally. He's a good officer. He's retired from our military. He is well trained. But this bill puts him and his family at risk.
I'll ask you, Mr. Valdez, a law enforcement officer who's willing to quit over this specific law, do you want that person to be law enforcement at all?
You know, that's a good question, and that goes back to the individual. What I want to say is, you know, there's a lot of good law enforcement out there, and I want to thank our law enforcement for what they do in the line of duty every single day and protect our communities. There's just a certain percentage of bad law enforcement that makes the good law enforcement look bad, and that we don't need those individuals. We need to make sure that everyone's accountable for their actions, but most importantly, making sure we're protecting our community in all aspects. Yes, I believe in the carrot and the stick, because we need to make sure that we live in a healthy and a civil community, and make sure that everyone doesn't have to live in fear.
I'm just going to wrap up this topic with what type of law enforcement reform is just right, and what, again, like my first question, what goes too far?
Well, I think we need to go back to the table and see and compromise on both sides. And it just is not one-sided or another. We need to make sure that all law enforcement's at the table and see how we can make sure that, yes, education and training, but we need individuals out in the community too, making sure that our community is safe and protected.
Before I switch to Mr. Taggart, was any part of that law enforcement bill too far?
We could go back and look at the accountability, the liability on our sheriffs and our local police.
Mr. Taggart?
Yes.
What part was too far?
The part that allows police officers, not the law enforcement agency that they work for, to be the one who will have to be held liable. If I'm working on any other job, there's an accident, there's a mistake, there's going to be insurance, there's going to be that company who's going to handle any lawsuits that result from that. So that's just a bad bill to hold a police officer personally accountable financially. Now, as far as his job, let's let that organization, law enforcement agency, decide whether they need to keep their job or whether they do need to be fired, because sometimes there are bad officers and there are bad calls in the field, and sometimes there needs to be consequences. But this bill definitely goes too far.
We hinted at this toward the beginning of the debate. I'll start with you, Mr. Taggart. Because of COVID-19 drastically changing the sales tax revenues, not just at the state level, but locally also, although as I'm learning in Alamosa, not as bad as elsewhere in the state, actually probably better. As a state lawmaker, do you support asking for more money from residents, or do you cut, and what do you cut from?
Sure, so Colorado's budget is somewhere, I believe, $32.5 billion for last year. There is room to cut, as we've seen. If we look at our surrounding states, none of them have this sort of inflated budget that we've got. And so we can definitely say that there probably is some waste. There probably are things that we can do to cut out some of our budget. And that's what we need to look for.
If I'm not mistaken, Tabor dictates how much you're allowed to have in a budget year to year. So Tabor, as a Republican thought to begin with from Douglas Bruce, allowed the budget to be what it is. and some would argue there's not enough in the budget, but just like you don't support the idea, and I think, and Mr. Valdez, you could correct me, I think it's 27, somewhere the general fund money that the legislature has to play with is not that total amount. But you think the piggy bank's too big to begin with?
Well, I do, and as I said before, there's not necessarily a lack of finances, it's a lack of desires by the legislators who go to the state capitol with a special project in mind, whether it's, universal pre-K, something that we simply can't afford as a state. And so we need to make sure that we're looking at things that are actually sustainable. We're not just going there to pass bills, to get our names on bills, to pass frivolous laws. So we can definitely make some cuts, and we can definitely rein in our state government.
Mr. Valdez, and I feel like I may have already asked you this, but are you asking for more money from residents in this time if you need to backfill budgets that aren't where they're supposed to be? And if not, what area are you cutting?
Well, Marshall, I'm asking in Proposition EE to raise a tax on nicotine products and vaping. That will allow more funding for education, for healthcare, for homeless housing. With that, we need to repeal Tabor. Yes, there's caps with Tabor, but that funding, we're already receiving that tax from you. Let's utilize that in our education. Let's utilize that in our infrastructure. Let's utilize that for our health care. That will continue to increase those programs, increase higher ed funding. We need to look at the funding model again and go back to that, because how imperative it is for sustainability in rural Colorado now more than ever, it's critical.
What are the potential economic drivers that will bring professional, good-paying, non-service jobs to this area? And again, it always falls back to what is a lawmaker, what's your power to make that happen in this area?
Well, Marshall, the San Luis Valley in southern Colorado is vital in agriculture. If we can continue to look at byproducts of agricultural products, absolutely. Building our infrastructure creates jobs. Our health care, San Luis Valley Health is one of the leading employers in San Luis Valley. Valley-wide health clinic services are huge economic drivers and for the jobs. But bringing in industry, I would like to see us utilizing more of our forests now more than ever. Why? Be creating biomass renewable energy. If we can utilize some of our dead timber that we have in our forests now, instead of letting them fall and rot on the ground, that creates jobs not only from on the top of the mountain, but all the way down. We can create an OSB plant that we have a mobile chipper on site and send those chips from one location to the next and have an OSB plant. Next thing you know, we're putting that on rail, whether it be to Denver, to the growing city that continues to grow and that wants our water, but at the same time, we can continue to fight for our water here in the San Luis Valley.
How do you do that as a lawmaker? And if it's possible, where was that bill this past session?
That's one of my policies that I'll be looking at coming forth now in January as we move forward.
Mr. Taggart?
Yes.
The idea of what will drive good jobs to southern Colorado and what, as a lawmaker, is in your power to help that effort?
Sure. Well, there's 4 things that are going to help, or I guess that help drive economic sustainability. So one is attracting jobs. But in order to attract the jobs, you have to have a good workforce. And to have a good workforce, you need to have affordable housing, and you need to have broadband high-speed internet. And so those are the things that a legislator can advocate for, try and get funding for broadband to this area, make sure that we have high-speed internet to attract these companies to come here. We can work with other municipalities to make sure that we're developing our affordable housing so that we can actually attract a workforce. And we've seen with COVID that people can work away from a major metropolis area. They can work online, virtually, and so we can attract people to this area. We've seen a great number of people moving here. And that's going to be the main things that attract jobs.
High-speed internet isn't something that just got created last year. Why has it been lacking, Logan Taggart, at the state capitol for any bill to come out that addresses this issue?
Well, because it's not a priority for our legislators, apparently. It's not new, but when you've got companies that are looking to provide higher speed to a larger customer base, they're going to spend their infrastructure and development on the Front Range. So our job as a legislator is trying to provide incentives, pass legislation to be able to attract broadband and high-speed internet to rural Colorado.
I want to combine two topics as we get close to the end of this debate, rural Colorado and health. Adams State, proud to be a nursing school. Work is being done here, not here, but in the state, on revising the hospital licensing requirements related to nurse staffing. Mr. Taggart, I start with you. Do you support mandatory nursing staffing ratios and nurse staffing committees?
Well, I don't know if having a mandate on a minimum amount of staffing makes sense in a place that already struggles to get adequate staff and workers in our hospitals to begin with. So I feel like it just makes it our local hospitals struggle even more to put more regulations on them.
Does it help a rural area by having minimums that says if you're going to be in operation, you at least need this many jobs there?
Well, it only helps if they can actually find people to come here. And so being able to attract medical professionals to Southern Colorado is important. I know that the state already offers some sort of benefits for medical professionals to practice in rural Colorado. So supporting those sort of measures is important. Otherwise, it just hurts, because if we can't meet those guidelines, then what's going to happen? We pull the licensing for these facilities, or they're required to shut down. So it's not helpful.
Mr. Valdez, minimum staffing requirements?
We need to have manageable staffing at all times for our patients, making sure that our patients have adequate health care from day one. Absolutely. We need to make sure that not only the education, but for instance, Adams State University right here with their nursing program, making sure that education is key in moving forward in all aspects of training, licensing, and moving forward for our patients now in rural Colorado more than ever.
I'm going to end on this question, and it kind of ends where we began. Mr. Valdez, I'll begin with you. We have, what are we at now? It feels like 3 years, but almost 6+ months of COVID practice of a pandemic. You're in charge. We wouldn't have shut down all businesses, it sounds like, under stay at home. What would COVID-19 response have looked like with Mr. Valdez in charge?
Well, Marshall, health and safety is number one in all aspects, but we need to make sure that we're collecting data, making sure that we have our healthcare services and needs on all aspects with our hospitals, emergency responders, but making sure that nobody's getting sick. It's essential right now more than ever, and during this pandemic, that we continue to practice social distancing, making sure if you're sick, please seek medical care. Please stay home. Please don't get anybody else sick. If you do, please tell them. And you don't have all the answers in one basket. That's why you have to adapt to not only this pandemic, but making sure that everybody in the realm is safe and not. I don't want anybody, dying in my hands either.
Mr. Taggart, I know you're not privy, just like Mr. Valdez, you're not privy to the meetings that the governor has had, but what does pandemic response look like to Mr. Taggart in charge?
Thank you. Well, it starts with changing our definitions of essential and non-essential. That was one of, I think, the biggest errors in the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we say that Walmart and Home Depot are essential, but our mom and pop shops and restaurants aren't. You know, church is non-essential. Well, that's essential for a lot of people. So the problem is that we pass these orders, these guidelines on a statewide basis. If I had been privy to the opportunity to influence our response, it would have been laying out guidelines and then allowing businesses to decide what's best to keep their business running, protect their customers, allowing individuals to make what the best choices are for them so that they can protect themselves and their families. But one size fits all is not okay and not fair to the individuals who have to live under those regulations.
In fairness now, I know we've got this new map underway that gives not one size fits all, but by county. And I know even this district, last I looked at the map, and maybe I'm confusing the Senate district with the House district, but it looked like level 2, level 1 is kind of mixed in here, like close to the final stage of opening back up as much as possible right now. Mr. Taggart, you get to go first with your 60-second closing.
Well, thank you. I again want to just say thanks to Adams State for allowing me to be here, for hosting this event. This election is about the choice that our state is heading in. Our state is heading down a path of overregulation, increased taxes, and crime. Every election is important. I'm running to make sure this isn't the last important election we have. Our current representative is a nice person, but he's given away his vote to the radicals in his party, voting with Boulder and Denver legislators over 90% of the time. I want to represent our entire district, not just the party that I belong to. I promise to put local values first. I care about businesses and families that live and work in this district. I promise to make sure our schools are the best that they can be for our communities. I promise to vote to protect our forests, our outdoors that have made our state a wonderful place. I promise not to pass legislation that will burden voters or infringe on our constitutional rights. I'm Logan Taggart, running for House District 62. I'm asking for your vote. If you'd like more information, please visit our website at taggartforcolorado.com.
Mr. Valdez, 1 minute.
Thank you, Marshall, and thank you, Adams State University. Thank you to the students. It is an honor to be here. But also representing rural Colorado means being a steward of the land and water. Water is lifeblood of our rural communities, and it needs to remain with our farmers and our families. We must remain vigilant and protective of our public lands and forest areas, seeking creative ways to mitigate fire dangers in rural and mountain communities. I will continue to support broadband initiatives to provide connectivity to our rural areas so we may support reliable access to necessities like telehealth, stable connections so that our small businesses can continue to do business locally, nationally, and globally. I will make sure we have the connectivity for our schools and distant learning needs. I will continue to work with the state of Colorado to cultivate the economy of our rural markets. We will explore opportunities to grow and fortify our existing enterprises while mindfully attracting growth from other businesses and sectors. Together, we will embrace the unique resources of rural Colorado and lean into them. Supporting our veterans is paramount. Contributing to organizations through time and financial support have been key to the work that I do. Our veterans have given their time, talents, and lives. We must recognize and support these men and women and their sacrifices for our freedoms. As your representative, I will be here with you, shoulder to shoulder, to face whatever challenges come our way. We will plan and we will pivot for contingencies to meet the needs of our institutions, small businesses, communities, and most importantly, our families.
So with that all, we remain
strong together. I, Donald Valdez, appreciate your vote for State House Representative District 62. Thank you.
And I was going to say, what a great debate where we all stayed on time. We ended on time. Just the openings and closings were a little rough. Ballots go out October 9th. You should get them in the mail starting that weekend, probably October 12th. And you have until November 3rd you can get them back to your county clerk in a number of ways. The recommendation, if you mail it, is 8 days in advance. Otherwise, the ballot drop boxes, here's going to be my cheap plug, 9news.com has a list of all of the ballot drop boxes and voting in person places. You will have no excuse not to return your ballots, where you will see the names of now, again, Representative Donald Valdez and Logan Taggart for House District 62. Thank you for staying on time for 98% of it, and appreciate your time. We'll be back in 15 minutes with our Senate district debate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's explain a complex state law with a simple man. A man named Fred. Wave at the people, Fred. Fred owns a house in Colorado. Let's say it's worth $400,000. Tough to find, I know. Fred also owns his own business. And let's say for the sake of argument, Fred's shop is worth $400,000 too. Convenient, I know. Property taxes aren't assessed on the full value of your home, but on an assessment rate set by the state. Fred's home property taxes are assessed at 7.15% of the value of his home. Fred's business property tax is assessed at 29% of the value of his shop. That 29% business assessment rate is frozen by a piece of the Colorado Constitution called the Gallagher Amendment. The Gallagher Amendment, passed by the voters in 1982, requires that 55% of property taxes collected in Colorado have to come from commercial property owners, businesses in other words. The rest, 45%, comes from residential property owners. At the time, the constitutional amendment locked that tax assessment rate for commercial property at 29%, can't go lower or higher, and it set the adjustable residential rate at 21%. But a lot has changed since 1982. Colorado's grown significantly and the value of homes has skyrocketed. As those values go up and tax revenue increases, the tax rate for residential property has had to decrease to keep meeting that ratio.
At a statewide level, we have to apply this blanket policy, and it just doesn't work well for different parts of the state, especially rural and suburban areas that depend on these property taxes to help fund those important services.
The argument made by the bipartisan group of lawmakers who sent this repeal of Gallagher to the November ballot is that ratio requirement, 55-45, has led to lower tax rates for homes, which continue to increase in value. They argue schools, county governments, fire departments, and other special districts are losing out on money because non-residential property isn't increasing as much in value.
If Gallagher is not repealed, if we don't vote yes on Amendment B, we're looking at 10 to 15% cuts for those fire districts, for the hospital districts. EMTs rely on property tax.
Their proposal is to eliminate the ratio requirement. If you vote yes and agree, your residential property tax rate will freeze where it is and won't drop below 6% like it's expected to next year in order to maintain that 55-45 split. The bipartisan opponents consider that a tax hike.
That difference in the assessment will raise the amount that homeowners will pay if this passes. They'll pay that additional $203.7 million that they otherwise would not pay.
They argue there are better ways to get more money to schools and special districts, and that trying to squeeze more out of homeowners in the middle of a pandemic would be wrong.
The average hardworking homeowner that is already struggling in many cases to pay their mortgage, this could put people out of their homes.
So I know that was a lot to take in. Consider this as well. Property taxes, they help fund schools. And when the property taxes aren't enough to do that, the state has to come in and backfill. So proponents of Amendment B say you got to remember we're in the middle of a pandemic and the state's going to be a little hard up for cash with COVID and all. The opponents argue that the whole tax system could use an overhaul first before you go ahead and repeal what they call the lone tax break out there for residential property taxes. Kim, a lot for voters to think about as they get their ballots in the next few weeks here.
You did a good job. For those of us that have lived here for a long time, we can't explain Gallagher. So in a short amount of time, Steve, a lot to sort out.
I know a lot of people hear it and they probably think it's that guy that smashes watermelons with a sledgehammer. It is not. It's a very complex tax law. Dennis Gallagher was a state lawmaker at the time, hence why it's called the Gallagher Amendment.
Okay, we'll be reading more. Thank you.
that come from small towns across Colorado.
Breckenridge,
Placerville, Woodland Park, Callahan,
Canyon City,
Wiley, Delta, Fruita,
Windsor, Springfield,
Rye,
Trinidad,
Silverton,
Walsenburg,
Monte Vista, Vail.
To earn degrees that matter. Visit adams.edu to learn why so many kids growing up in small towns prefer a small liberal arts university in Alamosa. Adams State University. Feels like home.
Back at Richardson Hall in Adams State University, I'm going to remove the mask again. We did such a good job with that first debate. We didn't really replicate the presidential debate from yesterday, so we're going to try again with this. Now, again, how many times can I pull that joke off? You guys laughed. Our second debate of the night, Senate District 35. What if I told you you could represent 1/4 of the Colorado counties? You'd think you'd have all the power in the world, but you would still just be one of 35 senators. And there, next to me, the next senator for Senate District 35 is standing next to me to fill the spot of current Republican Senator Larry Crowder. Closest to me, Democratic candidate Carlos Lopez, and farthest from me, Republican candidate Cleve Simpson. You did not hear applause, not because we had an agreement with the crowd not to applaud, but because Richardson Hall here is empty of viewers and fans and the people that would normally be watching the debate in person. We did another coin flip ahead of this for the 1-minute opening. Mr. Lopez will go first.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank everyone here at Adams State University for this opportunity to address your campus, your community, and all the people that are out in the district that are viewing this moment. I have 3 major issues that I want to work on if I have the honor to serve you in the state Senate. Issues that I believe are essential for our future. We need a reinvestment in the infrastructure of Southern Colorado. The most important part of our infrastructure are our citizens, you and I. So since I have 1 minute, I will tap them off real quickly. First of all, rural education. We've got to make it better. Right now, we are lacking in funds from the state because of massive deficits. So how do we improve upon that? I will explain that in my debate this evening. 2, rural health care. How are we going to impress upon the state health departments that we are a vital necessity down here in our rural healthcare avenues for our people? 3rd, we need to make sure that the future of our agricultural and natural resources are protected. No to the Republican water resources. Not going to have it. Lastly, the thing that ties this all together is broadband. We need to make sure that we have access because we need to be on the same playing field as everyone else in the state. We are just as smart, just as talented. We just need the same playing field. I'm Carlos Lopez. Thank you.
And just like the first debate, at the 75-second open now for Mr. Simpson.
Thanks, Marshall. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Cleve Simpson, 4th generation farmer and rancher from the San Luis Valley. It's wonderful to be on campus in Colorado's oldest Hispanic serving institution here at Adams State. Because as I've traveled around the district, there's a growing recognition about the divide between urban and rural Colorado. There is an opportunity going forward to bridge that divide, though, with the right leadership and skill sets. The pandemic has generated an opportunity to pivot us away from that trend and really come together as a community. So people across the state have a growing interest in where their food and water is sourced, and that can be of great benefit to Senate District 35. I bring to the table, a demonstrated ability to bring various stakeholders together to advance organizational missions and lift each other up. I look forward to doing that.
Let's get underway. I want to start with a COVID-specific question just because it's always on everybody's mind, I feel like, for the last 6.5 months. But I start with you, Mr. Simpson. One of my favorite questions. As a Republican, what is one executive order from the Democratic Governor Jared Polis that you thought was spot on?
Spot on would be a bit of a stretch, but I do think, look, I wasn't privileged to the same information that he was getting, but the safer at home at least gave the appearance of the ability for us to get back out into the community and some level of economic activity to reoccur. So that was probably as close as I thought too, as being supportive of the decisions he was making, not having access to the same information.
And since you still have 30 seconds from that answer, what went too far?
The very first one, the stay-at-home order again, where picking winners and losers of who was essential and who was not essential. Retail marijuana shops being essential, but churches not being essential. That just went too far from my perspective.
Mr. Lopez, let's reverse that. What went too far from the executive orders?
I believe that there was not an independent review for individual counties, which I would have liked to have seen passed from the CDPHE down to local public health departments, because not every county is the same.
There's been a focus on public health departments in the metro area as a result of the pandemic, realizing the power that a public health department and a non-elected public health board has in a state of emergency. Does the state legislature, Mr. Lopez, need to revisit what powers exist under a state of emergency, both to the governor and perhaps to public health departments?
Well, I think you hit it right on the head there. It's a state of emergency. These normally would not be occurring without the pandemic. So I want to rely on my public health officials, who are not just a lay elected official who may be having expertise in business or if they were in the military. These people are specifically tuned into the health department and the needs that are going to get us through this.
Mr. Simpson, is there too much power given to the governor and public health departments?
Yes, there is. There should have been more power shifted to local control, to county commissioners. And in reality, there should be, look, I think the governor was acting well within his statutory authority, but at some point, a predefined time period after 30 days, I think he should be required to come back and re-engage with the legislature and seek either an extension of that emergency order declaration or suspension of it, and really bring some balance back to the conversation.
Well, let's stay with you on this question about the legislature. There was that discussion of, did the legislature convene for what it should have, and it did not convene for the maximum 120 days. So I take it from that previous answer that you thought they should have been in session earlier and longer.
And longer, yes.
So what was a missed opportunity? What did the legislature not get to do by not being in session for 120 days?
Thoughtful legislation, really rushing legislation under circumstances of emotion instead of engaging with the stakeholders across the state. I think just things were rushed, and there wasn't that necessity to do that rush.
I don't know if it's 2/3 or 3/4. I know it's like a supermajority that would have been needed to override a state of emergency. And with the Democratic numbers the way they are, it would have never happened. So even if the legislature was in session, what could have changed? The state of emergency still would have existed. The governor still would have had the executive order powers, and the legislature at the same time would have been in session. That one would not have gotten rid of the governor having that power. So what could have changed had lawmakers been in session?
Well, again, just the opportunity to be a better engaged legislator. And really what I would be advocating for was that there is a time limit to that emergency order, and that the governor would have to seek an extension of that going forward. I mean, that's going to take a while to get to that, because I don't think anybody expected these kind of circumstances to exist for 6 months.
Mr. Lopez, do you believe there should be a time limit on an emergency order in terms of state of emergency?
I don't think it's a bad idea, but considering what the pandemic and the leadership we had from up above at the national administration level, we were flying by the seat of our pants. We were really left to our own avail. I think that the governor did the best that he could, considering the lack of national leadership that we had coming down through either the mixed messaging, through the National Institutes of Health and CDC, through the president's office.
I'm about to get schooled by the two of you on water. I know I am. You're both smarter on the topic than I am. Let's start with Mr. Lopez. In your open about the renewable water resources, I know on your binder you've got no RWR on it. So let me shift a question I had planned for you. Is there any level of proper compensation for water from the valley, from the area here, to go to the Front Range?
Everything's always for sale, but I wouldn't like it to be sold. And it's legislators' position to make sure that we give opportunities for people so they feel that they don't have to sell their last valuable resource. It is up to us, whichever one of us gets elected, to provide alternatives and opportunities so people can continue to keep their land with their water without having to have issues about diversification and selling it off to other parts of the state. I think that's what our roles are, to have ideas. Now, sure, we can't make promises, but we are working our butts off to make sure that we work to sustain the water down here in the San Luis Valley, the lower Arkansas Valley, and any other tributary that runs through our district.
Mr. Simpson, did I miss your binder that has no RWR on it also?
It's on the bumper of my pickup.
What can you do as a single lawmaker to prevent water from being taken for the benefit of the metro area?
Predominantly make sure agriculture stays vibrant and relevant in these communities, and that people can afford a good way of living here, and really help facilitate the conversations at the IBCC where it's embedded. You mentioned the Colorado Water Plan. There's a mechanism for these conversations to take place between basin transfers. So the legislature, I would hope to be appointed to be the legislative representative on the IBCC. I've presented to them personally my opposition to renewable water resources. I serve on that committee now as a representative from the Rio Grande Basin Roundtable. So there are only a few things the legislature can do right now, short of really impacting people's private property rights, and I can't stand for that.
Mr. Lopez, thank you for doing the presidential thing of raising your hand and waiting to be called on to rebut. Let's hear what you have to say.
Well, I just have concerns because right now, I think in the last debate, we both agreed that climate change is something we agree that is occurring. And according to an August 30th publication in the Denver Post, my opponent was quoted saying that, they're doing all these things like trying to modify growth of new types of vegetation, et cetera, but they're still losing ground. And the reason why is because, quoting him, we're just not getting enough snow. So in the meantime, if this is the predominant trend where we have a couple good years and it drops down, a couple more good years and it drops down, we need to make sure we have alternatives like energy production. If we can't farm our normal way of life, let's start farming solar fields. Sell people electricity, not water.
Mr. Simpson, is there any amount of compensation that could change your mind?
Oh, not mine personally, no. I'm one of if I'm successful in this regard, I'll be one of a very few, a minority in the state legislature that actually owns a water right. There's no amount of compensation here that would convince me or my dad or my grandmother who've done this for now 4 generations. And to characterize this as a political battle, splitting it, calling it Republican water resources is ridiculous. Those lines get blurred immediately when you talk about this basin has come together repeatedly, Republican and Democrat, to fight this. There are as many Democrat supporters and proponents of this proposal as there are Republicans.
I want to bring up I brought this up in the last debate about perhaps the metro area's idea of solving the water crisis in the state was to allow sports gaming. Is that the perception down in southern Colorado, that's the idea of the Front Range, that, man, we can bet on the Broncos, we have solved Colorado's water future? Do you see that as voters thought they just solved the problem, what are we talking about?
No, I don't believe voters did, especially in southern Colorado and rural Colorado. They unanimously rejected that proposal, and I think it was out of a fear that funding would go to support projects just like this one. I actually think that money can end up being valuable here. We end up using it through water reserve fund accounts from CWCB to advance any number of water projects in this basin. And the magnitude is $10 million. The need is about $100 million for the next 20 years.
Mr. Lopez, coming from the Front Range, are me and my friends naive to the fact that the ones that thought that sports gaming was the end-all be-all?
Oh, yeah. I agree completely with my opponent on this one. I don't think that's going to save our issue here, especially in the San Luis Valley. According to the Colorado State Demography Office, Colorado is expected to increase in population between 7.7 and 9.3 million years by 2050. And this is information from the Citizen's Guide, Where Your Water Comes From. It's a 2nd edition. And also, according to the 2019 analysis and technical update to the Colorado Water Plan, industrial municipal demand is going to be up on the increase of 35 to 77% by 2050. Now, taking into effect how that affects people here in the valley, the technical project updates the gaps in agricultural water availability increasing by 444,000 acre feet per year to 1,053,000 acre feet per year. So, and that's as the climate warms, which is the trend that we're seeing. I mean, I drove in here today and there's smoke all over on the Front Range. I came in here and it was clear for a moment unless you look south. We are finding these issues to be negatively affecting us, and I'm sorry, but throwing $10 million at this isn't going to be an answer. We need to make sure we make good, comprehensive plan to pivot.
Last question on this topic is the 2030 goal of replenishing the aquifers. Is that something that's realistic, and should the state legislature be involved in addressing the timeline there? Mr. Simpson.
It's absolutely realistic. And I'll note that we're talking about the confined aquifer system and an unconfined aquifer system, not a connected and an unconnected aquifer system. And there is opportunity to get there. We've worked really hard for the last 9 years to reduce the amount of irrigated acres, to find practices to help farmers improve their efficiency. And we're well on our way to make that target. We had a setback in 2018, the 4th worst drought in the Rio Grande's recorded history. Made recovery last year and will struggle this year. But we have no other choice. We will work to get there.
Mr. Lopez, realistic?
I don't think so, honestly. I mean, according to Clinton Phillips of Davis Engineering at the latest Rio Grande Water Symposium, he was using the Thiessen mean method, which is a basic way of how they measure all these wells. And he's saying that according to their 5-year plan, they need 680,000 acre feet to recharge. Well, right now that puts that for the unconfined aquifer at 82,000 acre feet per year. And the way that the trends have been going on the product that's on their website, it's been trending down. And I just don't see it with the way that we've been having warmer summers, warmer winters. I mean, today is the last day of monsoon season, and the monsoon season keeps pushing further and further back as we go. So unfortunately, the growing season, the dry growing season of 2018 reversed 3 straight years of gaining water levels. And that really put people back because of drought, overconsumption, and then you have other issues with a federal compact with like the Closed Basin Project.
I knew I was going to get schooled on this subject. 30 seconds to rebut that.
Those are Tyson polygons that my opponent's referring to, and it's a weighted average of the change of the aquifer, and we've been measuring it monthly since 1976. The subdistrict started in 2012, Subdistrict 1, where this unconfined aquifer measurement is occurring, and we are on a path to recovery. It does take about 80,000 acre feet a year, but we've had years with 200,000 acre feet of recovery. We've had years of minus 400,000 acre feet of decline prior to the subdistrict coming into existence.
Well, thank you both for that education on water. Let's move to education. K through 12, we'll start with, and I'll start with Mr. Lopez. You mentioned in your opening about a lack of state funds. But again, to my understanding of how it works for K through 12 education, budgets are set, county property taxes take care of the budget, and whatever isn't met, that's when the state backfills the difference. So the county takes care of it. Unless it can't, then the state comes and fills the rest. Based on your opening, what's the state supposed to do besides do what it already does?
I've got a plan. My plan is to utilize the marijuana tax law. It's Colorado Revised Statute 39-28.8-203. Right now, the way that these percentages are stipulated, as to allude to what Mr. Taggart mentioned earlier, they're not what we thought they were going to be when we voted this in. Right now, K through 12 only gets 12.59% of these total funds. 70% goes towards the marijuana tax fund, which has a myriad of things that it goes to, which are good. And then the other 15% point something goes towards the general fund. I want to flip those numbers, which can be done with the legislative piece, so that way we don't increase taxes on our property owners. But what we're doing is we're taking monies that we're bringing in from this vice industry and we're applying it towards our schools. It will be tens to almost hundreds of millions of dollars.
Sin taxes is the only thing that really passes in Colorado. Why should we be funding education through people's habits?
Why not? Honestly, if people are going to consume vices, we have one for gambling that's supposed to help water. It's basically an additional usage of any type of consumable. or a service. So if they're willing to do it because they have the extra funds, then let's apply it to make sure that our kids are going to be well educated to take care of me and my opponent when we get older.
Mr. Simpson, is the problem with K-12 funding the fact that the state isn't providing enough?
Well, the state's providing what it can. We live in a state that set, very intentionally restricted the growth of government. So there's only limited resources to apply and prioritize where they go. If we're going to shift money and shift the allocation in the marijuana tax cash fund, are we going to engage with the stakeholders that are on the losing end of that proposition? Human services to about $32 million a year, local affairs at $16.5, CDPHE at $21 million a year, and higher education that's going to lose out in that proposition as well. It's a fixed source of money. How you allocate it becomes a little problematic.
I'm going to take a quick curveball because we talked about Proposition EE from the previous debate. Proposition EE would increase taxes on tobacco, a new tax on vaping. Part of that money says, as of today, would go towards school. First, do you support that proposal?
Reluctantly, yes. Again, sin taxes are this bizarre kind of revenue stream. I will support it.
Then, and I'll get to you, Mr. Lopez, on your support or not, but the idea that today it says one thing, and we're talking about the pot tax. People thought it was going to do something else. It can be diverted elsewhere. Why should someone trust? If we pass this, it's going to do this, and 10 years from now, hey, remember that thing wait, does it really do that? Why should we trust it's going to get spent the way, as of today, it says it's going to get spent?
Yeah, that's what representative government is about. That's why those legislators, you can't bind a future legislator to something today. So that's the system that we have to hold people accountable. If it's not going where you think it's intended to go, vote that legislator out.
Proposition EE, yes?
Yes.
And then the idea that you're making an argument to spend money for education in a way that wasn't necessarily intended when that was previously passed. Why should this be trusted as, hey, we're going to spend it this way, even though you're making an argument to spend previous money in a way it wasn't intended?
I believe that all fundings need to be flexible to a certain degree, as necessitates by whatever is going on in the current event cycle. If you have an issue where you're lacking in a certain area and maybe there's another position where it was supposed to pay for and it's doing well, and maybe it's not as efficient as it used to be, well, that's where you trim the fat and you make calculated decisions to determine how can this money be spent to its most capacity? How do you get the most bang for your buck? And sometimes you have to move around funds. Now, as long as the voters approve them, then let's continue to use our money in a fluid capacity.
This district covers 16 counties. I'm going to have to guess there are kids in these 16 counties that are currently struggling with remote capability of learning. What is the state's responsibility to make sure the technology is there and the infrastructure for that technology is there?
Well, first of all, we need to get with our U.S. senators to make them apply pressure to the FCC when they granted money to internet providers, where they were going to upgrade all of their systems to 25 megabits per second, which is technically broadband, even though it's really slow. We need to make sure that that's available, because like even at the Youth Club of Trinidad that I'm the founder of, we have kids that are coming in there, and we had to boost up to a business class internet speed to make sure that they could handle their learning capabilities.
Mr. Simpson, is it the state's responsibility or is it the school district and county commissioners?
Well, I think it's a combination, but certainly this state should be taking the lead. And like Carlos has referenced, that we need to leverage the federal side of this equation too and work with them. But I do believe ultimately it's the state's responsibility. How are you going to fund this thing, again, in a system that's really constrained is problematic. So bigger priority, K through 12 funding or the roads that get you to the K through 12 schools? K through 12 would be a higher priority for me. Mr. Lopez?
K through 12.
Let's talk quickly about transportation then. Where does that fall into the equation? I've covered many a director at CDOT, and a previous director, Shaylin Bott, was adamant that the gas tax had to be increased. But as we mentioned, the only tax that Colorado voters seem to approve are the sin taxes. What's the solution to get transportation more money, Mr. Simpson?
I think the template is probably unfolding for more regional transportation districts where those revenues are sourced more locally. Every time we try to do this statewide on a bond election, a ballot initiative, it just gets hammered. So I think people are transitioning to a different model in these kind of regional transportation districts. I think we'll see how they unfold, but I think they're probably the next step.
So that's the idea of asking voters locally for more money.
Right.
Like you're okay with that idea of asking for more money as long as it's concentrated.
Right there, yep.
Mr. Lopez, do you think let's start with that grand idea that I had. I didn't even touch. Do you think the gas tax should go up, Mr. Simpson?
No.
Do you think that, Mr. Lopez?
No.
What is the grand scheme statewide, and is the regional approach the way to go?
Well, the last time that I recall that we put to a vote to increase taxes that was going to go towards transportation was for our registration tax increase, for vehicles, that is. And that, I believe, was in 2008. Now, there may have been another one that came through, and maybe I'm just forgetting it. But that was one where people actually voted to increase it to improve our roads and bridges in order to affect the flow of traffic, et cetera. But I'm thinking, why don't we put a tax, if anything, on something where out-of-state people come into play? A luxury tax on, say, our hotels. And that could go directly towards helping our CDOT.
I want to say there have been so many ballot issues.
Two
I feel
in
like
2018.
And I can't remember if it's Prop CC. They blend together. Right. Educate me.
I just know there were two ballot initiatives to allow the state to go into debt for billions of dollars to fund transportation, and they were both
someone needs to fact check
soundly defeated.
Someone needs to fact check me. I feel like it was CC and DD, and they were
right. But that's why I said the one that did pass was back in 2008.
Mr. Simpson, I have a direct question for you as the Republican, based on last night's presidential debate, when the president who is the head of the Republican Party, essentially, was asked specifically about denouncing white supremacy, and specifically the Proud Boys. His response was stand back and stand by. Is that the position of the Republican Party you represent?
No. And I have no idea who that organization is, but that is not the position. There should have been a much stronger retribution of that from the president.
With an R next to your name, how do you separate yourself from that on the same ballot with the president and the R next to his name?
Well, by knowing me and knowing what I stand for, and that I believe in treating everybody with dignity and respect.
Let's move to higher education, since we're in a higher education institute here at Adams State University. And Mr. Lopez, I'll start with you. This past session, $493 million was cut from higher education. CARES Act money allowed most of that to be replenished, except for about $43 million. But the overall cut's 58%. If that one-time money does not exist in the future, and we're not growing the budget because of whatever reason, whether it's because the sales tax revenue isn't there or decisions made by the state legislature, what happens to Adams State University?
Well, that's a question for their Board of Trustees. Honestly, they're going to have to look at other financial avenues that they can pursue, whether it's through federal grants or state grants. But I believe, honestly, for higher education, they're probably going to have to look from other surplus funds from the general fund to go towards their school. Now, that's tough to say right now, considering the $3 billion deficit, but we are going to bounce back. It's a matter of time. We had the fastest growing economy in the union for a while there, and I believe that once we have an opportunity to do so, that's where we can pivot and continue to get funding to come here. And then you can also impress upon people your agricultural programming that's here. And I hate to say this, but I really hope that we get a new president, because therefore we can have new trade initiatives going through with our allies across the world, as well as with some people that we don't really care to trade with, but we need them. I'm not a fan of Donald Trump. I would like to know, are you a fan and supporter of Donald Trump?
I support the President of the United States.
He brought up, Mr. Lopez brought up asking the Board of Trustees, what about former Board of Trustees, to talk about what's going to happen to Adams State.
That'd be perfect.
There's a good segue. What happens to Adams State under this, the current revenue stream, the current economic outlook?
Challenges have existed for rural liberal arts institutions for a decade. So I was on the Board of Trustees for 5 years and 2 years as chairman of the board, and we continually fought with declining state support and really declining enrollment and retention at our institution, which wasn't any different than Western or Fort Lewis. So the challenge will be, how do you market this place to be a destination and an opportunity for people to take that modular step up in the economy, and convince and be an advocate at the state capitol that all institutions here aren't the same. The mission of the university should weigh heavily in funding allocation. We serve generally underrepresented population here, high Pell eligible, first generation students. Be a real advocate for that, and ask institutions to be very good stewards of that resource. And I can assure you, Adams State was, in our time frame, we did not raise tuition for 4 straight years. Now there's to make this place radically affordable to attract those students. A shortfall in funding is really going to complicate that discussion going forward.
When you look at budget cuts from the state legislative standpoint in the JBC, whatever's going to go to higher ed, whether it's cut or increase, should it be equitable? 10% to Adams State is,
No.
is the same as 10% to CU.
No, again, that's why I'm saying there should be a different analysis in the funding and a potential weighting to go, what's the mission of the university? And couple that with what's the total cash position of the university. Some of the bigger state institutions have huge foundational support that we don't have that kind of foundational support. That should be weighed into the equation of how much state funding and support goes to these institutions.
This is a bit of a right turn, but is that any different than saying we should tax the 1% higher than a lower bracket?
Oh, that's a leap for me a little bit, Marshall. I'm just saying, take the pot of money and those that serve a specific mission for the state and are really advancing the goals that the higher education had put forward together, ought to have a recognition of a little more funding for that.
Mr. Lopez, why I'm a graduate of CU Boulder. Should my alma mater be punished because it has graduates who perhaps contribute more money back to the school than a school like Adams State, where it might rely more on the here and now and the people who come to the school and the funding from the state?
I don't think they should be punished at all. I mean, that's why you have an alumni association. They choose to give back to their alma mater. Mine is the University of Northern Colorado. And I hope that one day I'm in a position where I can contribute back to those students and their educational growth. Right now, I think what we need to do is create a state fund from the Department of Higher Education that uses a database protocol to determine which schools are providing more programs that are efficient. Now, if we want to determine percentages, I'm in favor of building out trade programs, especially to our junior and community colleges, where we can start turning out more students in the blue-collar trade fields with less institutionalized debt. So that's how I would start to maneuver into marginalizing from some of the larger schools, providing more funding for smaller schools. Trinidad State Junior College, Lamar Community College, Otero Junior College, and even Ames up there in Greeley. That's another great program where we can allocate more funds so that way our people turn out to produce more good-paying jobs.
Mr. Simpson, what can rural schools promise that would get more funding from the state? I think in the past it's, hey, we're not going to increase our tuition. Like, is that as good as the promise can be, or is there anything else that needs to come from rural schools that get more money from the state?
No, that indeed this creates an opportunity for a generally underrepresented population to be more modular or mobile and take a step up and be more contributory to the greater community. If you can help us get them here and keep them here and put them in a position to be successful.
Does tourism at all play a role in getting students toward somewhere that's not in the metro area or somewhere that's not high profile? Do those two have to interact at all, Mr. Lopez?
Definitely. Right now, Trinidad just opened, or is about to open, the second largest state park in the state, and we are very proud of that. And our Trinidad State Junior College Trinidad campus is starting a trail building program. So with that ecotourism in mind, we're already pivoting into new trade positions that start to foster and nurture these tourists and also provide a good lucrative economy.
Tourism at all play into getting students to Adams State and Gunnison and anywhere else?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, that's one of the marketing tools we use routinely come here to these wide open spaces where there's an abundance of fishing and outdoor hiking and trail riding and hunting and fishing and camping. It absolutely is. There's a connection there. And I think out of the pandemic, that's I think a pivot we will see, an opportunity, you might say, out of the pandemic to really improve our circumstances here.
I want to wrap up on higher education, and perhaps you've answered this throughout your question or your answer so far, but how do you make, no matter where someone wants to go to school, affordable regardless of zip code? Mr. Simpson.
It's the response, from my perspective, it's a responsibility of the Board of Trustees and the institution to make sure they're being really good stewards of resources, both tuition and state income, and assuring those that your institution is very student-centered.
Mr. Lopez?
I believe that we need to impress upon Tom McGimsey and Venicia Kerr, who are the chair and vice chair of the Departments of Higher Education, that our rural schools are very pivotal down here, and that we need to be able to maintain our educational opportunities in a rural facility.
We're going to slow things down with rapid fire questions about the long statewide ballot. I hope you've prefaced everything by reading the Blue Book. For those that are just watching this debate and didn't see the earlier debate, I want to make sure that I explain what each of these ballot issues does so that you know what their yes or no answer means. Proposition 113 is the National Popular Vote Compact, which would give Colorado's 9 electoral college votes to the winner, the presidential candidate who gets the most votes nationwide. It will not happen this year, and it doesn't take effect until enough states agree to this compact. So, the state legislature put this on, or the people put this on the ballot after the state legislature originally passed it. Mr. Simpson, do you support Proposition 113?
No.
Mr. Lopez?
No, unless all the states are in accord.
Amendment B, which we'll get to in length in a moment, is the repeal of the Gallagher Amendment, which impacts the assessment rates that determine your property tax. Mr. Lopez, do you support the repeal of the Gallagher Amendment?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Simpson?
Yes.
Yes or no, do you support Proposition 118, the Paid Family and Medical Leave Insurance Program would provide 12 weeks of paid time off for family and medical reasons through a payroll tax paid by employees and employers? Mr. Simpson?
No.
Mr. Lopez?
Yes.
And the simplest issue on the ballot, actually, Proposition 116, reducing the state income tax rate from 4.63% to 4.55%. Mr. Lopez?
I would not want to reduce the rate.
Mr. Simpson?
A simpler answer, yes.
Let's go back to the Gallagher Amendment. And as I challenge the previous candidates for the House district, if you can get your answers in 60 seconds or less, bless you, even though you have to. It's a topic that I've struggled with to explain to viewers. But Mr. Lopez, repealing the Gallagher Amendment, why is it as simple as bubbling in the yes?
Well, for us in Southern Colorado, I believe it's essential because when you have property rates and the assessor's value going up, it's supposed to create a ratcheting mechanism that compresses back down. And when that mechanism occurs on larger economies with higher property values like the Denver Metroplex area, it negatively affects us down here in Southern Colorado. Los Animas County, where I'm from, has one of the lowest mills in the state at 9.38% or something like that. And because of the Gallagher Amendment, we have not been able to ratchet back up to where we used to be, around 17 or 18 mills. So as a result of it, we are losing so much funding for our school districts, our fire districts, our ambulatory districts. It's really a tremendous loss for us in rural Colorado.
Mr. Simpson, we're in agreement here. Why are you on the yes side of this?
Yeah, problematic for a Republican in my position to be supportive of it. But the Gallagher Amendment is just dysfunctional in rural Colorado, a lot like candidate Lopez has referenced it. As assessed values across the state increase, if your county's residential assessed values don't keep pace with that, and your mill levy is set, you end up with reduced revenue. So it's just time to reconsider how we want to run property taxes. So I'm going to support repealing the Gallagher Amendment and want to pursue making sure that actually becomes local control at the county commission level and not dictated by the state legislature. I haven't gone through all the unintended consequences doing that, but the counties set the mills, the counties do the assessment, the county ought to set the assessment rate.
It would not be, it would prevent the property tax from going down, or the assessment rate that calculates your property tax, so we prevent it from going down.
Correct.
You're in support of this, but do you believe that you're supporting a tax increase?
Well, yeah, that's what's problematic as a Republican. But if Alamosa County wants to maintain the same level of service, you have to recognize at least however you characterize it, you want the same revenue that will foster itself as a tax increase.
Would your opinion of this have changed at all in February, pre-pandemic, if any of the economic factors were not as bad as they are in local areas?
No, look, I participated in a Building a Better Colorado seminars last summer, pre-COVID, and this was one of the great topics of conversation. Amendment 23, Tabor, and the Gallagher Amendment, and how they're kind of coupled together, and how they've, from our perspective in rural Colorado, particularly Gallagher, how it's impacted, the ability for counties and special districts to deliver the services that are expected of them.
It'll certainly open up new conversations about K through 12 funding when you're not conflicting Amendment 23 and Gallagher at the same time. Mr. Lopez, for people that are like, okay, it's Gallagher today, as soon as you get that, what's next? How do you fight that idea?
I guess I don't understand the question, how we fight the idea of repealing another amendment?
The idea like, oh, we need to get more money for local, everything you listed.
Oh.
Fire, police, libraries, everything that basically is covered by property taxes. Well, if today it's let's get rid of a Gallagher amendment to solve that problem. How about a year from now? Oh, we still need money.
We put it to a vote. In Los Animas County, we had to put an additional sales tax vote on the ballot because our county courthouse was closed 2 out of 5 days of the week. And I think when you really hit the rock bottom like that and you determine we have to pay to have our services, people said, okay, I can get behind this 1 cent sales initiative. We need to pay to make sure that we have our own services. And that's the key. So as it comes as a necessity, if it's needed, people will do this. If not, then we'll continue on our way.
I want to shift to the law enforcement accountability reform bill that became law over the extended session. One aspect of it requires local law enforcement to fund body cameras, at least the local law enforcement that don't have it yet. And that's going to be at their expense. Mr. Simpson, I just want to start hyper-focused on that. The state passes this law and says, figure it out.
Yeah.
For this specific topic, at least of the body cameras. Was that fair?
No. Another unfunded mandate from the state. It absolutely is not fair and is burdensome, particularly on small rural communities. It was introduced, little discussion, and passed too rapidly. Passing legislation around emotion generally is not good public policy, and I think this is a reflection of that.
On that specific issue, about all law enforcement wearing body cameras, are you supportive of that?
I think it's a case-by-case basis. Generally, the body cameras have certainly proven very valuable. Where and when you use them, I get to local jurisdictions.
Mr. Lopez, the idea that I'm going to tell you what you need, you tell me how you're paying for it.
I don't agree with that. I believe that if we're going to have mandates like this, they need to be funded, because right now, when you go to a sheriff's office, they already have their budget laid out, and then you impose this particular requisite upon them that puts another financial constraint on them. I don't agree with that. Now, in terms of if they should all have body cams, I do agree with that. And not just for the protection of our citizens, but also for the protection of our departments and offices. In Trinidad, we had a case where if it wasn't for a body cam, one of our police officers could have potentially gone to jail. And the body cam provided evidence that he was in the right. So they are good. They are beneficial.
Bill was brought up end of May, passed and signed into law in June, and it was the end of August, beginning of September that we were part of coverage that revealed that it exempted state troopers from Colorado State Patrol and state correctional officers. So while there are protests going on in areas like Greenwood Village that was telling its police officers, we're going to exempt you from the personal liability. At the time, no one really knew that the state lawmakers had exempted state employees from that. Should, Mr. Lopez, Colorado State Patrol troopers and correctional officers be exempt from that personal liability aspect that every other jurisdiction has to abide by?
Well, I think you're going to have to look at the question is, are those state employees part of a union, for one thing, where they may have an insurance policy that protects them from these types of indemnification issues, to where the regular police department does not. That is something that I believe that if they aren't, then they should have been held to the same account. Now, for instance, if we have a police officer who does something that is erroneous and egregious and malicious, they need to be held to the fullest extent of the law because no one is above the law. But we have other people in our communities who have to get malpractice insurance. My wife is a nurse, and she has to get malpractice insurance. And she probably makes around the same amount of money annually when she's working full-time as a police officer. So what we need to do is create a state fund that creates a state insurance policy for these individuals.
As it relates to union, I mean, Denver Police have a union, Aurora Police have a union, and they have to abide by this. So having a union doesn't protect you from the personal
Correct,
liability.
but when you said a state employee, they may have a different protocol going on that I'm not privy to because I've only been on city council in Trinidad. I'm aware of my unions with our fire department and our police department.
Mr. Simpson, should state employees, state patrol troopers and correctional officers be exempt from something that every other law enforcement in the state has to abide by?
No, again, that's the outcome of a rushed legislation. I'm trying to figure out what was the problem the legislation was trying to fix. It's like, can you turn the clock back and have stakeholder conversation and engagement and clearly identify, was there a necessity or why would you exempt one category of law enforcement over another one? It's not clear that that was necessary.
If all the personal liability part of this law is saying is if you are found to have done something against the law while as part of your duty, you might be held liable for X amount of dollars. I'm drawing a blank, $25,000, $20,000 is the maximum, I think. And that law enforcement officer for whatever department says, I'm out. All we're saying is if you do something illegal, you might have to pay out of your pocket. And if that person leaves, do you want that person as a law enforcement officer?
Well, it's individual circumstances and why did that individual take that position. It's too easy to broadly, characterize somebody that didn't want to do that and stepped aside as maybe being not dependable and not accountable. So it's too general.
Mr. Lopez?
Well, I believe that when I was raised, you looked up to police officers. They were people that were a person of trust that you looked up to for help. And they are supposed to hold themselves to a higher standard because they are the enforcers of the laws that which one of us would be able to potentially create. And I believe that if they choose to step down because it's just a burdensome inconvenience, then yes, I don't want them there.
Is it easier to watch law enforcement in a smaller community than when you have hundreds of officers in a department? Is it easier to see when activity is not what you expect from an officer in a smaller community, that this law did not need to be imposed on a smaller community?
Definitely. I've seen police videos from when I was on city council in Trinidad, and you see who these individuals are because you run into them at Safeway, or maybe you might be on a bowling league with them together. It really does build a sense of community with your police department and other sheriff's deputies, and you get to know them, which I think is lacking in a lot of larger communities where people police in a different location from where they live. And I really believe that a better community sense would behoove all communities in this country if they had a more personal relationship with their police department and sheriff's officers.
Asked in a different way, was it necessary to put an outsider perspective in a good old boys club, perhaps? Like just putting that outside eye that says, we're watching you now. You may be okay, but we're watching you super close.
From a rural small community perspective, no. Again, because I have breakfast with these individuals. Our kids play basketball and softball together. We're connected. So there's something special and unique about growing up in rural Colorado.
Let's shift back to COVID-19. I know I asked you about the governor's executive orders. That's always just a fun opposing viewpoint. But let's talk more about what it's meant for tax collections in the state. As I've learned, the area of Alamosa, at least, is doing well locally with the sales tax collection compared to last summer. However, when you look statewide about who is spending money, where are they spending money, people are hurting, areas are hurting, and they're having to pare back the budgets. So in terms of priorities, I know we touched on K-12 versus transportation. Give me some bullet point list of what's your top priority. I'm gonna fund this no matter what with whatever money we have, and what's at the bottom that says, good luck finding the money and figure it out. Mr. Simpson.
So education, and I would really like to see us start talking about education in a continuum of K through 12 plus higher ed and stop differentiating them. It's one continuous stream. That would be at the top. Transportation would probably be at the bottom. Funding water projects, and there's not an abundance of discretionary spending at the legislature anyway. So if I was trying to prioritize them, and it would depend on the magnitude, but education would be at the top, transportation would probably be at the bottom.
Would you get rid of the Department of Education and the Department of Higher Education and combine that into one state department?
I haven't thought about it in those terms. I'd have to give that some, or at least got to start with the discussion about this is this is an education continuum, and stop trying to split that divide between K through 12 and higher ed.
Mr. Lopez, priorities.
Priorities for me is K through 12 education, hands down. A second priority that I have is making sure that people who have been left out in the cold through conservation easements on the southeastern plains, for instance, get their recourse from the Department of Revenue. And right now, there are struggling agricultural families that are not even getting the recourse from 2018's drought or the 2019 freeze. And it's really nice that the efforts that we've been conducting, we actually got a letter today that Governor Polis had sent out to Sonny Perdue, the U.S. Department of Agricultural Secretary, impressing upon him how these resources need to come back to help our local farmers and ranchers. And I'm very proud to have, been a small part of this, but I was included to let me know that this letter was sent. And I believe that my lowest priority would be probably capital improvements right now, construction capital improvements. We need to continue, I believe, with our Department of Transportation and making sure that we have safe roads for our people.
I was looking at that letter just before the debate began, and I didn't digest it enough to know. It seemed like part of an announcement today was adding counties to a drought state of emergency, that this area has already been under that declared state of emergency, and now we're adding the northern part of the state, the counties in the metro area and north. Does that take away from the resources that original order would have provided this area now that more counties in the state are part of it?
It does a little bit, but we got to remember, we're here to represent the entire state of Colorado. Of course, we specified in our district, but we are Colorado state legislators, or what we hope to be. And we have to look at the entire state's situation. Of course, we're going to have favoritism to our own local district, no doubt. That's our job. That's who we're here to represent. But in terms of everyone getting a piece of the pie, that makes me very happy because the people up north also need help.
Mr. Simpson, is this area in more need on this topic, drought related, than anywhere else in the state?
I would say it's not in any more need than the rest of the state. Southern Colorado is in need. The drought implications have been pretty broad. All across southern, you can almost draw a line at Highway 50 and south of Highway 50, really for the better part of almost 20 years. More often than not, we remain in drought.
I want to talk, yeah. Mr.
May I?
Lopez. Sure.
So just so everyone, if you can see, he's right. Southern Colorado isn't a pickle, but this orange area does also indicate a drought. It's a moderate, and this is severe, and that's extreme out in Kiowa County. So we all are in a pickle right now in the state.
Mr. Simpson, I don't know what, I know you can't necessarily have state legislation that focuses on a very particular audience, but what can you do as a state senator that helps with the revitalization of the downtowns of the different counties that Senate District 35 would cover?
Well, I suppose as a legislator, you're engaged with all those economic development groups in each one of these. There are numerous entities like that across every community here, making sure they get the support that they need from the legislature, if it's letters of support, if it's staff time and agency support and potential services that can help them in that regard. It's probably fairly limited what the legislature as an individual legislator can do, but that would be my commitment to assist in those discussions and be of assistance.
I might argue, as a city councilman of Trinidad, you probably had more power over revitalizing a downtown area. How does that change as a state senator?
Well, I think it's put me in a position with networking and relationships that I have built over the years. When I originally started out, Irv Halter was the director of local affairs, which we worked with tremendously in order to get projects done with matching funds. Then his successor, Mr. Garcia, came in, and we were able to continue a great relationship working with him at the Department of Local Affairs, so that way local municipalities can continue to improve upon their capital improvements in their communities. And while I was on the Colorado Municipal League's executive board, a board that I was elected to by other elected officials, I was able to touch even more more people with connections in order to help facilitate more projects in my small community. And I hope to take that to the next level and help out the rest of these 16 counties.
I want to end on rural health and the idea of what's being done to revise hospital licensing requirements and nurse staffing, because Adams State being proud nursing school. Mr. Lopez, the idea that nursing staffing ratios, there's a mandatory limit. Do you support the idea that the mandates on staffing limits and nurse staffing committees?
I don't think there should be a mandate if there's a necessity for the census of the hospital. What I think we should have, though, are more PCPs and more nurse practitioners in our rural hospitals, because that's where we're really lacking. We could really take advantage of having a cardiac catheterization process in Trinidad at Mount San Rafael Hospital. I'm sure San Luis Valley Health or Conejos County Hospital could benefit from that, as well as like the Arc Valley Regional Medical or Prowers Medical. We don't have the benefits that other hospitals have with the population, so we have to make sure that they're well staffed. And I think a mandate could negatively affect us in rural Colorado.
Mr. Simpson.
Yeah, I don't agree with a mandate either. I think that's up to each institution to decide, and keeping patient health and well-being first and foremost in those conversations. That's very much a local decision that shouldn't be mandated from the state.
Well, we've hit the point of the debate where you get to say whatever you want again. I want to thank everybody for watching as we head to our closing statements. Mr. Simpson gets to go first. I say 60 seconds. It's going to go 75. I'm okay with that.
Thank you. And again, it was a pleasure being here tonight and having these open, honest discussions. Look, I'm running for this office and support bringing balance back to the legislature. I'm committed to being engaged, thoughtful, respectful, open to conversation and engagement with the constituency across the district. There is an opportunity for Senate District 35 really to pivot and be instrumental in bridging that gap between urban and rural. I truly intend to be a citizen legislator, not a full-time politician. I'll keep working on my farm and ranch and coordinate with legislative duties and constituent expectations. Water is the predominant topic in this state going forward. I have the expertise in water to represent rural Colorado and Colorado in general, whether it's the Arkansas Valley Conduit, whether it's renewable water resources, whether it's CDPHE in an effort to file dredging and filling permit program this year, whether it's the Colorado River and the likelihood of us being in compact compliance issues and the statewide impacts of compact administration will have on Colorado.
Thank you. Mr. Lopez.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate the time. I appreciate you, Mr. Simpson. I just want to let you all know, I think we're both in accord that water is a necessity and of utmost importance in our state. It is the new gold, and we have to make sure that we protect it. But going along with other ideas, we have to have more than just our few pet projects. When I was on city council, I learned that you have to deal with the myriad of other things that come your way. And you're always often kind of sideswiped by them because you weren't expecting them. Sometimes they're reactive kind of issues. One of the things I want to impress upon people is I am prepared for this job. My time on city council in Trinidad has gotten me into governmental positioning so that way I know how these things work. They're not going to happen overnight. I know that. But through due diligence, you will be able to make sure things occur. My opponent has said twice on the record that if he knew the answer for certain questions, he'd be running for a bigger office. He said it once on KBLJ on June 29th on the radio when it came to how do you keep your young people here. He said it just last Monday on the radio on KSPK when it came to how do we impress upon the health industry here. I have solutions. I have answers. I'm ready for the job.
So much for the handshake for a responsible, honest, dignified campaign. I think it just went out the window.
Mr. Lopez, Mr. Simpson, I appreciate your time. You're going to see their names on the ballot that you get in the mail. They get sent out October 9th. You have until November 3rd to get them back to your county clerk. If you're going to mail it back, the deadline, I believe, is October 26th, 8 days before the election. 9news.com has a list of all of the ballot drop box areas and the voting in-person polling stations, as well as a place you can hand deliver your ballot to some other human being and then watch them put it in the place that goes eventually to the clerk and recorder's office is the next step after that. We appreciate Adams State University for hosting the House District and Senate District debate, and we appreciate both candidates. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.